Grace Miller spent 3 years mastering the art of becoming invisible to survive. But a single sentence signed in a dead dialect just exposed her as the one weapon the Chicago underworld never saw coming. To the patrons of the Obsidian, Grace Miller is nothing more than furniture, a silent, efficient waitress keeping her head down to protect her foster sister. She knows the rules of survival: pour, bow, and never look a predator like Kang Min-jae in the eye. But when she witnesses Min-jae's mother in distress, Grace breaks character, signing to the woman in a rare localized sign language from Jeju Island that hasn't been spoken since a brutal purge 20 years ago. Her cover shattered, Grace is dragged from the safety of the kitchen into Min-jae's fortress, where she is forced to confront the ghosts she tried to outrun. Min-jae reveals that he has intercepted coded transmissions from the Red Dragons, the same faction that murdered Grace's father, and Grace is the only person alive capable of decoding their timeline. Now, stripped of her anonymity, the shy waitress must prove she is not a victim, but a strategist capable of hunting down a traitor before a Lunar New Year assassin finishes the job. The minimalist pendant lights of the Obsidian cast long, sharp shadows across the black marble floors. Grace Miller adjusted her apron for the 10th time, her hands steady, but her pulse thrumming with the familiar adrenaline of a prey animal sensing a predator. At 23, Grace had mastered the art of becoming furniture, a silent, efficient ghost refilling water glasses. She needed this job. It was the only thing keeping her younger sister in a safe foster home. "Table 1 needs clearing," the manager hissed, "and don't look Mr. Kang in the eye. He's in a mood." Grace approached the table, keeping her head down. Kang Min-jae, the name alone carried the weight of a death sentence. He sat rigid, his immaculate suit unable to hide the dangerous ink creeping up his neck. Beside him sat an elderly woman, Hwayan, looking small and distressed. She was signing frantically, her hands fluttering like trapped birds, but Min-jae was too focused on his phone to notice her plea for tea. Grace knew the rules: pour, bow, leave. But the isolation in the old woman's eyes broke her heart. It was the same look Grace had seen in the mirror for 3 years. Against every survival instinct she had, Grace set down the pitcher. She raised her hands, a soft, sincere smile breaking her mask. Her fingers moved with fluid, practiced precision in the ancient localized sign language of Jeju Island that hasn't been spoken since a brutal purge 20 years ago. "The tea is hot, grandmother. Let it cool." The silence that followed was deafening. Min-jae's phone clattered to the table. He looked at his mother's delighted face, then slowly up at the black waitress. His mouth parted slightly, his composure cracking for the first time in a decade. He didn't see a server anymore. He saw a ghost from Seoul. The silence in the dining room wasn't just quiet. It was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against Grace's chest. She didn't wait for the shock to wear off or for the whispers to start. She spun on her heel, clutching the silver tray tight enough to whiten her knuckles, and marched straight for the kitchen swing doors. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Stupid, she berated herself. Sentimental and stupid. Invisibility was her armor, and she had just cast it aside for a moment of empathy. She burst into the kitchen, startling the line cooks. "I'm clocking out early," she told the confused manager, stripping off her apron as she moved. She didn't wait for permission. She needed the back door, the alley, the anonymity of the Chicago night. She navigated the maze of stainless steel prep tables, her eyes locked on the red exit sign glowing at the end of the corridor. It was 10 feet away, 5. She reached for the crash bar, her fingers inches from cold metal, when a hand slammed against the doorframe above her head. It wasn't a violent strike, but it was absolute, an iron gate slamming shut. Grace froze. The scent of expensive sandalwood and rain filled the narrow hallway, overpowering the smell of garlic and searing meat. She turned slowly, her back pressing against the cold steel of the walk-in fridge. Kang Min-jae loomed over her, filling the space with a terrifying, suffocating presence. Up close, the tattoos on his neck seemed to writhe beneath the collar of his shirt, and his eyes were void of the shock she had seen moments ago. Now they held only cold, calculating suspicion. "I'm sorry, sir," Grace stammered, forcing her voice into the higher, apologetic register of a terrified service worker. "I didn't mean to overstep. I just wanted to help your mother. I really have to go." "Drop it," Min-jae said. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of warmth. He didn't ask for her name. He didn't ask for her number. He stepped closer, invading her space until she could see the flecks of gold in his dark irises. "Who sent you?" Grace's breath hitched. "I don't know what you mean." "That dialect," Min-jae hissed, his gaze drilling into her. "Jeju rural, specifically the western coastal variation. It hasn't been spoken colloquially in 20 years, not since the Han family was wiped out in the Purge." He tilted his head, studying her not as a woman, but as a weapon he hadn't anticipated. "You aren't a waitress, you're a message. Who is the sender? The Red Dragons?" The mention of the faction that had destroyed her family sent a spike of genuine fear through her veins. He recognized the linguistic fingerprint of the old families. Grace realized with sinking dread that the exit door was no longer an option. If she ran, he would hunt her. If he hunted her, he would find her sister. "No one sent me," she whispered, the tremor in her voice real. "I'm nobody." Min-jae straightened, his expression unyielding. He gestured to the alley where two large men in dark suits had silently materialized in the rain, blocking the only path to freedom. "Nobody speaks the language of ghosts, Miss Miller," the use of her real name hitting her like a physical blow. "Your shift is over. You're coming with me." The ride to the north side was a blur of rain-slicked streets and suffocating silence. Grace sat in the back of the armored SUV, flanked by guards who looked more like statues than men. When the car finally slowed, it wasn't in front of a police station or a warehouse, but a towering glass spire that pierced the Chicago skyline. Min-jae's estate was a fortress disguised as a penthouse. The elevator opened directly into a sprawling room of polished concrete and floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic view of the city that felt less like a vista and more like a surveillance feed. There were no personal photos, no warmth, only the cold precision of a man who expected an attack at any moment. "Sit," Min-jae commanded, pointing to a single leather chair facing a massive mahogany desk. Grace obeyed, her legs trembling as the adrenaline began to curdle into dread. She watched as Min-jae poured himself a glass of amber liquid, his movements deliberate and predatory. He didn't offer her any. Instead, he pulled a sleek, encryption-heavy tablet from his jacket pocket and slid it across the desk. "For 3 weeks, my security team has been intercepting transmissions on a secure frequency," Min-jae said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room. "They couldn't crack it. My best translators said it was gibberish, dead noise." He leaned forward, bracing his hands on the desk. He tapped the screen. Audio static filled the room, followed by a voice, distorted, guttural, and speaking rapidly. To an untrained ear, it sounded like aggressive, rhythmic grunting. But to Grace, the sounds sharpened into words, and the words formed a picture that made her blood run cold. It was the Jeju dialect, yes, but it was twisted, laced with military slang and code words that hadn't been spoken since the coup in Seoul. "The heavy rain falls on the northern gate. The tiger sleeps. We strike at the new moon." Grace stopped breathing. It wasn't just the dialect, it was the syntax, the specific metaphor of heavy rain for a coordinated assault. This wasn't just old crime family speak. This was the signature code of the Red Dragons, the faction that had stormed her father's compound 3 years ago, the men who had put a bullet in the only father she had ever known. She looked up, her mask of confusion slipping away to reveal sheer horror. Min-jae saw the recognition flash in her eyes. He smiled, a cold, humorless expression. I see you hear them too, the ghosts. He walked around the desk, stopping inches from her chair. The threat of violence hung in the air, heavy and electric. These men are planning something in my city, against my family. Min-jae placed a heavy hand on the back of her chair, leaning down until his lips were close to her ear. You are the only person in this hemisphere who can decode their timeline. Translate them, Grace. Give me their names and you live. Refuse and you join the ghosts. The static from the recording hissed through the speakers, dragging Grace back to a study in Seoul that smelled of jasmine tea and gun oil. She wasn't Grace Miller then. She was the orphan girl sitting at the feet of a kingpin, learning that language was the ultimate cipher. Listen to the cadence, little bird, her father had whispered, tracing the Hangul characters that hid kill orders inside poetry. The silence between the words tells you who dies. He had taught her to read the pauses, the breath, the intent, skills meant to keep her safe, skills that had failed to save him when the red dragons kicked down the doors. She blinked, the memory dissolving into the harsh reality of the Chicago skyline looming through the glass. Min-jae stood over her, his patience eroding like a cliff face in a storm. You've been listening to the same 10 seconds for an hour, he snapped, slamming a palm onto the mahogany desk. The vibration rattled the tablet. We don't have time for hesitation. My men need a location. I'm not hesitating, I'm analyzing, Grace shot back, surprised by her own defiance. The fear was there, choking her, but the linguist in her refused to be bullied by incompetence. This isn't a textbook translation. It's a dialect built on misdirection. He says North Gate, but the inflection on the final vowel shifts the meaning to water. If I get the syntax wrong, I send your men into an ambush. Is that what you want? Min-jae's eyes narrowed, a muscle feathering in his jaw. He looked ready to drag the answers out of her, his violence a coiled spring. He leaned in, his shadow engulfing her. I want actionable intelligence, not academic excuses. If you are stalling to buy time for your friends, they aren't my friends, Grace hissed, standing up to meet his glare. They murdered my father, so back off and let me work. The air between them crackled, a standoff between a lion and a cornered gazelle. Before Min-jae could retaliate, a soft warmth settled over the room. The tension didn't break, it simply melted away. Kang Hwa-yan stood at Grace's elbow, a porcelain tea set on a tray in her hands. She didn't look at her son. Her gaze was fixed on Grace, her eyes crinkling with a gentle, knowing sorrow. She set the tray down and placed a weathered, soft hand over Grace's trembling fist. Min-jae sighed, his posture softening instantly. Mother, you should be asleep. Hwa-yan ignored him. She tapped Grace's hand to get her attention, then signed slowly, her movements fluid and calming. The tiger roars because he is afraid of the dark. Do not let his noise drown out your quiet. Grace felt a lump form in her throat. For 3 years she had been running from this world, terrified of the monsters in the dark. But here, in the heart of the beast's lair, the monster's mother was offering her tea. Grace signed back, her hands shaking. I am afraid too. Hwa-yan smiled, pouring a steaming cup. Fear is the price of protecting what matters. Drink, it clears the mind.
The tea had turned cold, but Grace's mind was finally burning hot, syncing with the rhythm of the distorted voices. She replayed the phrase, where the dragon swallows the pearl for the 100th time. It wasn't poetry. It was geography. It's a coordinate, Grace murmured, the realization hitting her with the force of a physical blow. She looked up at Min-jae, who had been pacing the perimeter of the room like a caged animal. They aren't attacking the warehouse. That was the decoy. Min-jae stopped mid-stride. Explain. The pearl refers to the moon in the old Dialect's calendar. The dragon is the host. It's the Lunar New Year gala, Grace said, her voice steady now, fueled by the clarity of the puzzle.
They're gonna hit you when you make the toast. The audio confirms the extraction point is the north service elevator, the one that requires a biometric override. The silence that followed was different from the one in the restaurant. It was the silence of a foundation cracking. Min-jae walked to the window, staring out at the city he thought he controlled. "The gala," he repeated, his voice dangerously low. The security schematics for that venue were finalized this morning. They were kept offline, hand-delivered. He turned back to her, and for the first time, Grace saw the exhaustion beneath the mask of the warlord. "Only my lieutenants have access to those schematics, which means the rot isn't at the gate, it's at my table." Grace shivered, not from cold, but from the sudden, terrifying intimacy of the revelation. He was admitting a weakness that could get him killed. "You have a traitor," Grace whispered. "I have a leak," Min-jae corrected, walking back to the desk. He didn't loom over her this time to intimidate. He leaned against the edge of the mahogany, crossing his ankles, bringing himself down to her eye level. He studied her, the ink stains on her fingers, the stubborn set of her jaw, the way she had turned her paralyzing fear into a sharp, analytical weapon. "You could have given me a false location," he said quietly, his dark eyes searching hers. "You could have sent me into a trap and tried to run while my back was turned." "I told you," Grace said, meeting his gaze without flinching, the memory of her father's murder stealing her spine. "I want the red dragons dead as much as you do." Min-jae reached out, his hand hovering for a split second before he tucked a stray curl behind her ear. The touch was electric, searing through the numbness of the night. It wasn't the touch of a captor checking his property. It was an acknowledgement of an equal. "Then we are no longer strangers, Grace," Min-jae murmured, the use of her first name sounding like a binding vow. "We are hunters." "Get down!" The command barely registered before the world turned sideways. Glass shattered inward as a heavy black SUV slammed into the passenger side of their armored sedan, spinning them across the wet asphalt of Lower Wacker Drive. The driver was gone instantly, slumped over the wheel, a red bloom on his chest. Min-jae was already moving, his gun drawn, firing through the spiderwebbed window at the shadows converging on them. But the car was dead in the water, pinned against a concrete pillar, the engine sputtering. "They're boxing us in," Min-jae growled, struggling to shove the driver's lifeless body aside to take the wheel. "Stay down, Grace." Grace looked up from the floorboard, her ears ringing. Through the cracked windshield, she saw the headlights of two more vehicles closing the gap. It was the pincer movement, standard execution protocol. "When the wolf bites, you don't pull away," her father's voice echoed in her memory, sharp as the gunpowder stinging her nose. "You drive into the throat." "Don't reverse," Grace shouted, scrambling over the center console as Min-jae reached for the gear shift. He looked at her, wild-eyed, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. "If you reverse, they flank us. Ram the lead car. The rear axle is the weak point." Min-jae hesitated for a fraction of a second, then saw the conviction in her eyes. It wasn't panic, it was geometry. He nodded once, slamming his foot onto the accelerator, not to flee, but to attack. Grace grabbed the wheel, wrenching it hard to the left as they surged forward. The sedan collided with the rear quarter panel of the oncoming SUV. Metal shrieked, sparks showered like fireworks, and the heavy attacker vehicle fishtailed violently, spinning out of their path and creating a narrow gap. "Go!" Grace yelled. Min-jae floored it. They scraped through the opening, losing a side mirror but gaining the open road, leaving the assassins in a cloud of smoke and confusion. 20 minutes later, the silence of the safe house was louder than the gunfire. It was a nondescript brownstone in an industrial district, dusty and cold. Min-jae checked the perimeter twice before locking the steel-reinforced door. Grace leaned against the kitchen counter, her adrenaline crashing into tremors. She hissed as she touched her temple. Her fingers came away bloody. A shard of glass had sliced her hairline during the impact. "Sit," Min-jae said. The command was soft this time. He retrieved a first aid kit and stepped into her personal space. The scent of gunpowder and rain still clung to him, but his hands were steady. He uncapped a bottle of antiseptic. "That maneuver," he said quietly, dabbing the cut, "that wasn't driving school." "My father," she whispered, wincing as the alcohol stung. "He said running makes you a target, attacking makes you a threat." Min-jae paused, his thumb brushing her cheekbone to wipe away a stray drop of blood. The violence of the last hour faded, replaced by a charged magnetic pull. He looked at the woman who had saved his life, not with a gun, but with the ruthless logic of his own world. "He taught you well," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips before returning to her eyes. "You aren't just a translator, Grace. You're a soldier." "I had to be," she breathed, leaning almost imperceptibly into his touch. "You don't have to survive alone anymore." The return to the penthouse felt less like a retreat and more like entering a tomb. The city lights below, once a symbol of Min-jae's dominion, now looked like 1,000 watching eyes. Grace ignored the throbbing in her temple and the exhaustion dragging at her bones. She swept the debris of Min-jae's desk aside, crystal tumblers, expensive pens, and laid out the personnel files she had demanded upon arrival. Min-jae stood by the window, nursing a fresh glass of whiskey, his back to her. He hadn't spoken since they cleared the perimeter. The ambush had been too precise, too intimate. "It wasn't a random hit," Grace said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. She moved 2 photographs to the center of the mahogany desk. "The attackers knew the secondary extraction route. That route isn't on the server. It exists only in hard copy." Min-jae turned slowly, the ice in his glass clinking. He walked over, looking down at the 2 faces Grace had isolated. One was the head of his logistics team. The other was a face Grace had seen smiling in photos on the mantelpiece, a man with a sharp jaw and laughing eyes. "Choi is incompetent," Min-jae said, dismissing the first photo. "But he's a coward. He wouldn't have the spine to sell me to the Red Dragons." "Then that leaves him," Grace said, tapping the second photo, Park Jun-ho. Min-jae let out a dark, incredulous laugh. "Absolutely not." "You manage your personal security detail," Grace pressed, her finger not leaving the photo. "He was the only one besides you who knew we were moving to the safe house. The timing of the pincer movement? That's military precision. Jun-ho served in the special forces, didn't he?" "Jun-ho is my brother in everything but blood," Min-jae snapped, his voice rising. The terrifying aura of the crime boss flared, filling the room. He slammed his glass down, liquid sloshing onto the wood. "We starved together in the orphanage. We built this empire from dirt. He took a bullet for me 3 years ago. Do not presume to know him because you read a file." "I don't know him," Grace countered, stepping around the desk to face him. She didn't flinch at his anger. "I know the pattern." "You're wrong." "Am I?" Grace asked softly. "Or are you just terrified that the only person you trust is the one holding the knife?" Min-jae glared at her, his chest heaving. "Jun-ho would die for me." "My father said the exact same thing about his lieutenant," whispered Grace. The memory was a cold stone in her stomach, the image of her father laughing with the man who would eventually open the gates for his executioners. He ignored the missing funds. He ignored the late-night meetings. He called it brotherhood. She reached out, touching Min-jae's rigid arm. "Loyalty is blinding you, Min-jae, just like it blinded him. And if you don't open your eyes, you're going to end up in the same river he did."
The crimson silk of the gown felt less like evening wear and more like a target painted on Grace's back. She stood at the entrance of the grand ballroom, her arm looped through Min-jae's, the heavy fabric concealing the small tactical knife strapped to her thigh. To the hundreds of guests celebrating the Lunar New Year, she was merely the mysterious, beautiful companion of Chicago's most feared kingpin. To Min-jae, she was a radar system in heels. Breathe, Min-jae murmured, his voice a low vibration against her ear. If you look terrified, they'll smell blood. I'm not terrified, Grace lied, her eyes darting across the sea of tuxedos and traditional handboks. I'm calibrating. They moved into the crowd, a shark cutting through a school of fish. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and roasted duck, masking the metallic tang of danger Grace could taste on her tongue. Min-jae was rigid beside her, his gaze scanning the perimeter, but Grace watched the hands. She ignored the faces, the smiles, the toasts. She watched fingers tapping on glass stems, adjustments of cufflinks, the subtle language of the body that betrayed intent. Near the orchestra, holding court with a champagne flute in hand, stood Park Dun-ho. He looked every inch the loyal lieutenant, charismatic, relaxed, laughing at a senator's joke. Min-jae's grip on Grace's arm tightened, a silent warning to be wrong. He wanted her to be wrong. He wanted his brother to be innocent. He's positioned near the kitchen exit, Grace whispered, not moving her lips. Strategically, it's the best vantage point to command the room. He's enjoying the party, Grace, Min-jae replied, though his jaw was set in granite. Watch his hands. A waiter moved through the crowd, carrying a silver tray of empty flutes. He didn't stop to serve anyone. He moved in a straight line, cutting a path toward the stage where Hwa-yan was seated, accepting well wishes from elders. The waiter's eyes flicked briefly to Jun-ho. It happened in a heartbeat. Jun-ho didn't break his conversation. He simply laughed, raising his hand as if to smooth his lapel. But as his fingers brushed the silk, they formed a shape, a sharp downward hook of the thumb and index finger, followed by a flat palm. To the room, it was a meaningless gesture, but to a native of the western Jeju coast, it was the sign for extinguish the candle. The waiter nodded imperceptibly, sliding his hand beneath the napkin covering his tray. Grace's blood turned to ice. She stopped walking, anchoring Min-jae in place. He just gave the order, she said, her voice trembling with the weight of the truth. Jun-ho, he just signed the kill command. Min-jae looked at her, searching for doubt, but found only absolute certainty. The denial in his eyes shattered, replaced by a devastating cold fury. Where? Demanded Min-jae. The waiter, Grace said, pointing with her eyes. He's heading for your mother.
Grace didn't think. She let the training she had buried for 3 years take the wheel. As the waiter reached beneath his napkin, Grace lunged at a passing server. She didn't bump him, she shoved him with calculated force. The tray of red wine launched into the air, crashing spectacularly onto the white marble floor in a shower of crimson liquid and shattered crystal. The assassin faltered, his footing slipping on the slick mess. That split second of hesitation was all Min-jae needed. He didn't shout a warning, he drew his weapon in one fluid motion and fired. 2 shots thudded into the waiter's chest, dropping him inches from the stage. The ballroom detonated into chaos. Screams tore through the air as hundreds of guests scrambled for the exits, a stampede of tuxedos and silk gowns. But the threat wasn't over. From the crowd, 4 more figures drew weapons. The Red Dragons had embedded a full strike team. Grace, the stage! Min-jae roared, firing blindly to suppress the attackers as he fought his way through the panicking mob. Grace was already moving. She sprinted toward Hwa-yan, who sat frozen in her chair, her eyes wide with confusion in the silent cacophony. Grace vaulted onto the platform and tackled the older woman, driving them both to the floor behind the heavy oak banquet table, just as bullets chewed up the wood where Hwa-yan's head had been a second before. Curled on the floor, shielding Hwa-yan's body with her own, Grace scanned the room. Min-jae was pinned down near the orchestra pit, trading fire with 2 gunmen. He was cut off. A shadow fell over them. Grace looked up to see Park Jun-ho stepping onto the platform. He wasn't rushing. He walked with the calm of an executioner, stepping over the body of the first assassin. He raised his gun, aiming not at Min-jae, but down at Hwa-yan.
"I'm sorry, Auntie," Junho said, his voice strangely gentle amidst the gunfire. "He needs to lose everything to see the truth." He tightened his finger on the trigger. Grace moved. She rolled away from Huayan, snatching a pistol that had skittered across the floor from a fallen bodyguard. She didn't fumble. She didn't shake. She rose to a knee, her grip firm, her elbows locked, and leveled the barrel directly at Junho's heart. Junho froze. The shock of seeing the shy waitress hold a weapon with perfect tactical discipline stalled his hand. The room seemed to hold its breath. For the guests still cowering on the floor, the illusion was shattered. The terrified girl from the restaurant was gone. In her place stood the daughter of the Soul Syndicate, her eyes cold and deadly. "Drop it," Grace commanded, her voice cutting through the noise like a whip. She didn't blink, "or I will bury you right here, Junho."
Junho didn't lower his weapon because of the gun in Grace's hand. He lowered it because of the shadow that fell over him, cold and absolute. Min-jae stepped onto the platform, his tuxedo torn and bloodied, his face a mask of ruined brotherhood. There were no speeches, no demands for explanation. Min-jae simply raised his own weapon, the heartbreak in his eyes hardening into steel. "You were my shadow," Min-jae whispered, the words lost in the ringing silence of the ballroom. "Now you are just darkness." 2 shots rang out. Park Junho fell, and with him the threat that had haunted them both. 3 days later, the rain over Chicago had washed away the blood, but the city still felt different. Grace stood on the tarmac of a private airfield, the wind whipping her coat around her legs. Min-jae stood before her, holding a thick manila envelope. "Zurich," he said, extending the package. "A new identity, a fully funded account. You can disappear, Grace. You can finally be the ghost you tried so hard to become. No one will ever find you." It was everything she had wanted for 3 years. Safety, anonymity, an exit. Grace looked at the envelope, then at the black SUV waiting a few yards away where Huayan sat, watching them with hopeful eyes. She looked back at Min-jae, seeing the man beneath the monster, the one who had bandaged her wounds and trusted her with his life. "I spent 3 years hiding in plain sight," Grace said softly. "I realized something at the gala. I don't want to be invisible anymore." She didn't take the envelope. She reached out and took his hand. Min-jae stared at her, his composure cracking just enough to reveal a profound relief. He interlaced his fingers with hers, squeezing tight. "Then let's go home." A week later, the Obsidian was humming with its usual Friday night energy. The pendant lights cast the same long shadows, and the clinking of silverware created the same symphony of wealth. But tonight, the staff moved with a nervous, reverent energy around table 1. Grace Miller walked through the dining room. She wasn't wearing a black and white uniform. She wore a sharp, tailored navy suit that matched the man walking beside her. She didn't bow to the manager. She nodded, an acknowledgement of equals. Min-jae pulled out her chair at the center table. Grace sat, and the shift in the room's gravity was palpable. Across from her, Huayan clapped her hands in delight, her face beaming. Grace smiled, genuine and unafraid, and raised her hands. "The tea is perfect tonight, grandmother," she signed in the dialect of the old families. Min-jae watched them, a rare, unguarded smile touching his lips as he poured tea for the 2 women who ruled his world. Grace caught his eye over the steam, and in that look there were no secrets, no masks, and no ghosts. She was finally seen.